Welcome back to Grounded by the Neutral Wire, where we keep you grounded. I'm Jules Mercer.
And I'm Eli Watts. We're here to cut through the static and follow the current of what's really powering our communities.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a topic that really touches nearly every family and community in Ohio: school funding. This isn't just about abstract numbers or, legislative jargon. It's about the very foundation of our public education system.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about what it means for students across the state. Opportunity, equity, the daily reality in classrooms.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack this really complex history of how Ohio funds its schools.
Right. We're going to explore the profound impact of key legislative decisions like House Bill 920.
And dissect the contentious EdChoice voucher program, too.
Definitely. And we'll culminate our discussion with the really significant June 2025 court ruling just 2 days ago that declared EdChoice unconstitutional.
Understanding this whole journey is absolutely crucial, isn't it? To grasping why our public schools face the persistent challenges they do today.
It really is. We're here to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from, court documents, legislative analyses, recent news.
Giving you a clear, calm, and focused understanding of a system that often feels incredibly opaque.
Yeah, so you'll learn not just what happened, but why it matters directly to you and your community.
And what the long-term implications might be for Ohio's students. So let's unpack this complex issue. When we talk about school funding, it often feels like this unsolvable puzzle, right? A perpetual crisis.
It really does.
But the struggle over how Ohio funds its schools and legal challenges, this stretches back decades.
Oh, yeah. We're talking legal battles that go way back, even into the 1970s.
So how did all of this begin to unfold in the courts? Where's the starting point?
Well, what's truly fascinating here is how consistent the challenges have been over time. This isn't a new fight at all. It started much earlier than many folks realize, back in 1979, with a case called Board of Education v. Walter.
Walter. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. This was a direct and pretty significant challenge. It was brought by the Cincinnati School District, actually, along with some concerned parents and students.
And what was their main argument back then?
Their core argument was that Ohio's funding system, as it stood, violated both the Equal Protection Clause and the Education Clause of the Ohio Constitution.
So basically saying it wasn't fair and wasn't enough?
Exactly. They were saying the system wasn't fair and it wasn't adequate to provide a proper education consistently across the state. It wasn't meeting that constitutional bar.
So, a pretty clear assertion. How did the Ohio Supreme Court respond to that initial challenge back in '79?
Well, at that time, the court applied what's known as a rational basis test. It's a relatively deferential standard of judicial review. It doesn't require a super high bar for the state to meet.
Okay.
And under this test, they ultimately upheld the state's school funding system back then.
They upheld it, despite the challenges.
They did. The court concluded that the system complied with both clauses, mainly by citing a legitimate state interest in preserving local control over schools. You hear that a lot.
Local control, right.
And they also pointed to the existence of something called the Education Review Committee.
What was that supposed to do?
Well, nominally, it was tasked with figuring out the necessary funding for each student to get a general education of high quality.
Huh. So for then, in 1979, the court basically said, okay, status quo is fine.
Pretty much. They affirmed the status quo, kind of deferring to the legislature's approach at that time.
But that clearly wasn't the end of the story, was it? Almost 2 decades later, something really pivotal happened, something that changed everything.
Precisely. That brings us right to 1997. And the landmark case of DeRolph v. State.
DeRolph, that's the name everyone knows.
That's the one. This was the moment the Supreme Court of Ohio dramatically reversed that earlier Walter decision.
Reversed it completely.
Completely. In DeRolph I, they found the state's school funding system, despite, earlier affirmations, to be unequivocally unconstitutional. Full stop.
Wow. On what grounds? What was the specific violation?
The grounds were a clear violation of the thorough and efficient clause of the Ohio Constitution.
The thorough and efficient clause. Can you explain that?
Sure. It's found in Article 6, Section 2. and it's quite explicit. It requires that the General Assembly shall make such provisions, by taxation and otherwise, as will secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools throughout the state.
So the court was basically saying, legislature, you are not doing your job.
That's exactly what they said. You are not meeting this fundamental constitutional obligation.
And what's really striking about DeRolph, from what I understand, is that the court didn't just issue a dry legal ruling. They included really vivid, almost jarring examples of what inadequate looked like in Ohio schools.
They absolutely did. It wasn't just abstract. The court devoted considerable attention to a huge amount of anecdotal evidence and testimony. And it painted a truly grim picture of the conditions in many, many schools across Ohio.
Like what kind of conditions are we talking about?
I mean, we're talking about situations where failing school infrastructure was just rampant. Textbooks were ancient or sometimes non-existent. There was a severe lack of even basic supplies and equipment.
Basic supplies?
Yeah. Imagine conditions like plaster literally falling off walls in schools. This was mentioned specifically in places like Perry County.
Falling plaster. Goodness.
Cockroaches crawling on restroom floors, students having to deal with flooded libraries and gymnasiums.
Flooded.
Yeah. One anecdote described rainwater dripping from the ceiling like a literal waterfall because of leaky roofs. Kids had to physically move their desks just to avoid getting soaked while trying to learn.
That sounds unbelievable, like something from 100 years ago, not the 1990s in Ohio.
It really does. And the examples just kept coming, painting this picture of profound neglect. There was documented arsenic in water wells at Glenford schools.
Arsenic, that's a health hazard.
A direct health risk, exactly. And shockingly, the court found only about 20% of existing public school buildings in the state were satisfactory in terms of accessibility for handicapped students.
Only 20%.
Yep. Which meant some handicapped students had to literally be carried to certain locations within their own schools just to access their education.
It's awful.
Evaluations for identifying and placing handicapped students were sometimes done in former closets, with just one light bulb, just a profound lack of appropriate facilities.
And it wasn't just the big infrastructure stuff.
No, not at all. Basic supplies were being rationed. In districts like Southern Local, teachers testified they were issued just 1 or 2 boxes of paper for the entire school year.
1 or 2 boxes for a whole year?
For the whole year. Many teachers were forced to buy their own supplies. Paper clips, copier time, art supplies, chalk. Even toilet paper was rationed in some places.
Toilet paper?
Toilet paper. The court heard testimony that some schools relied on donations of basic necessities from parents just to get by.
Wow. And this kind of chronic underfunding, it must have directly impacted the teachers and the quality of instruction too, right? Made it hard to keep good staff.
Absolutely. Southern Local was highlighted for that too. They had one of the lowest average teacher salaries in the entire state.
Right.
Ranking 557th.
557th.
Which directly translated into this cycle where they were forced to hire inexperienced teachers because they simply couldn't attract or keep experienced ones who can obviously command higher salaries elsewhere.
So the court saw all this, and what was their main takeaway? What did they want the state to do?
Well, the court explicitly stated their ruling wasn't about some kind of Robin Hood approach, taking from rich districts to give to poor ones.
Right.
Instead, they emphasized that there should be but one system of public education in Ohio.
One system, meaning equity across the board.
Exactly. Their point was crystal clear. A student's location within the state, whether they live in a wealthy suburb or a poor rural area, shouldn't dictate whether they get adequate services or are stuck in these kinds of substandard learning environments.
And they gave the legislature a deadline.
A strict deadline. 1 year. Create a new constitutional school funding system. Fix this.
Okay, so a stark mandate, a tight deadline. What happened next? Did the General Assembly manage to fix things in that year, or did this just drag on?
Well, the General Assembly certainly made attempts to address the ruling. They didn't ignore it. They passed House Bill 650 and House Bill 770.
Okay, what did those bills do?
Together, they aimed to create a new school funding system. This new system outlined a basis for determining the base cost of educating each student, the foundational amount needed per kid.
The base cost, right.
And it aimed to phase in substantial increases to that per pupil base cost formula. It also introduced subsidies for districts with low property values and for high poverty districts, and created a new special education funding system. So these were definitely steps toward addressing the court's concerns.
But these steps, while maybe significant, clearly weren't enough, were they? Because in 2000, just 3 years later, the court weighed in again.
Exactly. They essentially said, Nice try, but not good enough. Try again.
And that brings us to DeRolph II.
That's DeRolph II in the year 2000. The court again found the new system unconstitutional, on essentially the same grounds as the 1997 decision.
Still not thorough and efficient.
Still not thorough and efficient.
Yeah.
While they acknowledged the General Assembly's efforts, they stated that more needed to be done.
Yeah.
The changes just hadn't gone far enough.
Did they give more specific instructions this time, like a blueprint?
Not a precise blueprint, no. But they did highlight several key areas that still required immediate and substantial attention from the legislature. Well, number one, the continued and persistent over-reliance on local property taxes as the main funding mechanism. That was a huge one.
Still the property tax issue.
Still the property tax issue. Also, the critical need to immediately increase that basic aid formula amount, the base cost, without slow phase-ins or artificial caps. Just fund it properly now.
Okay.
And continued attention to school facilities. Remember that 1990 survey? It identified a staggering $10.2 billion needed for repairs and improvements statewide. That problem hadn't magically disappeared.
$10 billion. Wow.
Yeah. They also pointed to needing improvements in school solvency assistance, fully funding state mandates things the state requires schools to do but doesn't always pay for, and eliminating what they called phantom revenue.
Phantom revenue. We need to circle back to that one. It sounds intriguing.
We definitely will. It's crucial for understanding how things work today.
So it really sounds like a core persistent problem, even after these multiple rulings, has always been this heavy reliance on local property taxes. It just keeps coming up.
It is. It absolutely is. And it's something that fundamentally sets Ohio apart from many other states.
How so?
Well, Ohio, even today, relies more heavily on local revenue, primarily those locally voted school district property tax levies, than it does on state revenue to fund its public schools.
That seems backwards compared to elsewhere.
It's a contrary to the national trend, yeah. Typically, states contribute a larger share, and federal funds, by comparison, play only a minor role in Ohio's overall picture.
And the problem with relying so much on local property taxes?
The stark reality is that it creates significant and, frankly, inherent disparities. There's a strong direct correlation between a district's assessed property valuation per pupil, basically, how much property wealth is in the district, and its total expenditures per pupil.
So richer areas can spend more on their kids' schools?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
It inevitably leads to what are widely referred to as rich and poor school districts. For instance, the sources we looked at indicate that the wealthiest 200 districts in Ohio spend over $1,000 more per pupil per year than the bottom 200 districts.
Over $1,000 per student difference. That's huge when you multiply it across a whole school.
It's a massive difference in available resources for students, for teachers, programs, technology, everything.
And that directly undermines that whole idea the Supreme Court talked about in DeRolph, the but one system idea.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It fundamentally creates two, sometimes vastly different systems, depending entirely on where a child happens to live and how much property wealth is around them.
So how did this whole DeRolph legal saga finally end? Did the court just give up?
Well, the direct court action phase of the DeRolph litigation finally ended in 2003 with a case called State X Rel. State of Ohio v. Lewis.
And what did that case decide?
It effectively left the responsibility for fixing the school funding mechanism squarely, and finally with the Ohio legislature. The court essentially stepped back from direct oversight at that point.
So the ball was firmly in the legislature's court after 2003.
Yes. But, and this is a big but, despite the urgency and the repeated findings of unconstitutionality from the state's highest court, there has been, according to the sources, little action to fully remedy these outcomes in the, nearly 2 decades since?
Actually, 2 decades.
Many of the core issues identified by the court back in the 90s and early 2000s remain unresolved and persistently affect Ohio's public education system today. It's a systemic problem that has just proved incredibly difficult to dislodge.
Okay, so with this history of underfunding, the system being declared unconstitutional multiple times, and this heavy reliance on local property taxes, you might think that those property taxes would at least consistently rise to meet school needs, right? Maybe keep pace with inflation.
That would seem logical, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but that's not quite how it works in Ohio, is it? There's this unique piece of legislation that seems to fundamentally prevent that from happening.
You're right. It traps many districts in this cycle of that phantom revenue we mentioned and constant appeals to voters.
And we're talking about House Bill 920?
Yes, House Bill 920, enacted way back in 1976. It is a truly unique and profoundly impactful piece of Ohio legislation affecting school funding. Understanding its mechanics is absolutely essential to grasping the current situation.
Okay, so 1976, what was the reason for it back then?
Well, its origin dates back to the 1970s, which was a period marked by extremely high inflation and rapidly skyrocketing property values. People were seeing huge jumps in their property tax bills.
Ah, okay, so it was a reaction to that.
Exactly. Many states, including Ohio, responded to this pressure by implementing laws designed to slow property tax increases and provide some relief to taxpayers. HB 920 was Ohio's specific answer to that pressure.
So it started as a taxpayer safeguard, a way to keep property tax bills from getting out of control. But how does it specifically work, and what are its maybe unintended consequences for school revenue today?
Okay, it works through what's officially called a tax reduction factor.
Tax reduction factor. All right.
Now, to understand it, first remember that in Ohio, real property like houses and land is assessed for tax purposes at 35% of its market value.
Okay, 35%.
And tax rates are expressed in mils, where 1 mil is 1/10 of 1%, or $1 for every $1,000 of assessed value.
Got it.
Now, what HB 920 does is this. As property values increase, which happens during county reappraisals or triennial updates, which occur by law every 3 years, the effective millage rates of existing voter-approved levies generally go down.
They go down, even though the property value went up.
Yes, the effective rate decreases. This mechanism ensures that taxing districts, including schools, receive roughly the same amount of revenue that voters originally approved when they passed that specific levy years ago.
So they don't see their revenue automatically increase just because property values went up due to inflation or market changes.
Exactly. They don't get that inflationary growth on their voted millage. The idea was to prevent windfall revenue for governments just from inflation.
So if the value of my home doubles over, say, 10 years, the school district doesn't necessarily get twice the property tax revenue from my home from that levy I voted for 10 years ago.
That's the core of it. It seems almost counterintuitive, but it's built right into the system by HB 920.
Can you give an example of how much the rate might drop?
Sure. One source mentioned a school district might have an original voted tax rate of, say, 97.45 mils on paper.
Okay.
But due to HB 920 applying these reduction factors over time as values rose, the effective rate actually applied to a house or a farm could drop significantly, maybe down to 56.27 mils.
Wow, that's a huge drop, from 97 down to 56.
It illustrates the very substantial impact this legislation has on the actual revenue districts can collect from those existing levies they rely on.
And this brings us back to that term the Supreme Court used, phantom revenue.
Exactly. This is where phantom revenue comes directly into play. The court called it that for a reason.
So if property values are going up on paper, but the actual revenue collected from existing levies isn't really increasing, how on earth do schools keep up with rising costs? You know, teacher salaries, utilities, books, fuel for buses, all that stuff goes up.
This is the crucial problem. This is the true consequence of HB 920. Local revenues simply cannot keep pace with inflation and rising operational costs, even as the underlying property values in a community increase.
Because the tax rate keeps adjusting downwards.
Right. That increase in real property valuation from inflation does not translate into increased tax revenue for schools from those voted levies, thanks to the reduction factor.
So that's the phantom part. The value is there, but the revenue isn't.
Precisely. It's growth that appears on paper, on property valuations, but it doesn't actually materialize as usable funds for the district's budget from those specific levies.
So what's the only way for schools to actually get more money then? To cover rising costs or, heaven forbid, add a program?
The only way for schools to genuinely increase their revenue to maintain existing services, let alone expand them or just keep up with inflation, is to repeatedly go back to the voters. They have to ask voters to approve new levies.
New taxes. Over and over again.
It's a constant, never-ending cycle forced upon them by this mechanism.
And I can definitely imagine voters getting incredibly tired of seeing school levies on the ballot practically every election cycle. That sounds exactly like levy fatigue, a term I've certainly heard thrown around.
It absolutely is levy fatigue. And it's a very real and frankly exhausting phenomenon for both school districts trying to make their case and for the taxpayers who have to keep voting on them.
Is it worse in Ohio than other places?
Well, as a direct outcome of HB 920, Ohio has more school levies on its ballots than any other state in the nation.
More than any other state.
Well,
Wow.
School districts are put in this position where they are, as one source put it, essentially compelled to present a facade of stability and fiscal awareness, even though a large percentage of their tax dollars are not truly within their control to grow with inflation or even cover basic cost increases.
So they look like they're always asking for more, but it might just be to stand still.
Often, yes. And this constant need for new levies inevitably leads to this levy fatigue. It's not at all uncommon for districts to have to try multiple times to get a levy approved.
Like you hear about levies failing and then being put back on the ballot again.
Exactly. We saw examples cited like Bowling Green, where a bond issue needed for a new high school building actually took 5 attempts to pass before it finally succeeded.
5 tries. That's persistence.
It truly is a Sisyphean task for many districts, just trying to keep the lights on and maintain the programs they currently offer.
I can see how incredibly frustrating that would be for communities. I've heard this firsthand from local districts, too. Marymount City Schools, for example, they've stated publicly that without successful local levies, their programs and the opportunities for their students would undeniably shrink. It would jeopardize the quality their community expects.
That's a common refrain.
And they even projected that if a proposed state bill that further limits school savings passes, they might need to put operating levies on the ballot every 1 to 2 years.
Every year or two. Just relentless.
And they were very clear, saying this isn't because they're mismanaging money, but it's because of these state-imposed limits on how they can actually generate revenue.
That's a perfect and very concrete illustration of the direct consequence of HB 920 in action. Districts are forced into this relentless cycle, even when they are managing their finances responsibly and being fiscally prudent. It's a structural issue baked into Ohio law.
Now, is there any exception to this? Does HB 920 affect every single levy the same way?
There is one small nuance, yes. It's an important one, though. It's called the 20 mil floor.
The 20 mil floor. Okay, what exactly is that and who benefits from it?
The 20 mil floor is essentially an exception within HB 920's rules. If a district's effective tax rate, remember, that's the rate after the HB 920 reduction factor is applied, falls below 20 mils for its operating levies.
Below 20 mils, okay.
That HB 920's tax-reducing feature is essentially short-circuited for those specific mills.
So what happens then?
In those specific cases, increases in property value do translate into higher taxes and more revenue for the school district from those specific mills below the 20 mil threshold.
So those mills become growing mills, unlike the others.
Exactly. It allows those districts to benefit from rising property values in a way that most districts cannot on their main operating levies.
And how many districts actually benefit from this floor?
Interestingly, the sources suggest about 2/3 of Ohio's school districts currently benefit from this 20 mil floor to some extent.
2/3, that sounds like a lot.
It is a significant number. However, for the remaining 1/3 of districts that are not yet at this floor, the fundamental challenge of suppressed revenue growth from their main levies and the constant need for frequent new levies remains a significant and pervasive hurdle.
So even with the floor helping some, it doesn't solve the underlying problem created by HB 920 for everyone.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It truly highlights just how fundamentally constrained the system is for most districts trying to keep up.
Okay, so between the DeRolph rulings highlighting chronic underfunding and the persistent impact of House Bill 920 limiting local revenue growth, it paints a really challenging picture for public schools in Ohio.
Definitely. A structural bind.
Now, to complicate matters even further, Ohio has also been a pioneer, maybe controversially so in another area. School voucher programs.
Yes, that adds another whole layer of complexity.
Let's talk about EdChoice and how it fits into this already strained funding landscape. Where did Ohio's journey with vouchers even begin? It wasn't EdChoice initially, was it?
No, Ohio has a quite notable and long history with school voucher programs, actually predating many other states. The first major one was the Cleveland Scholarship Program.
In Cleveland, okay. When was that?
That began way back in the 1996-1997 school year. It was specifically designed to allow qualified students in the Cleveland Municipal School District to attend participating private schools using public funds.
And I seem to remember that being controversial right away.
Oh, highly controversial, because it used public funds, and critically, over 80% of the private schools involved were religiously affiliated.
Ah, the church-state issue.
Exactly. It very quickly faced intense legal challenges. Opponents argued it violated the separation of church and state under the First Amendment. Public money for religious schools.
And how did that crucial legal challenge play out? Did it go all the way up?
It did. In June 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a really landmark ruling, upheld the legality of the Cleveland Voucher Program.
The Supreme Court said it was okay.
Yes. That decision was pivotal. It essentially allowed public funds to flow to religious schools through parental choice, setting a precedent that other states then followed.
So that opened the door. Did Ohio create other programs after that?
Yes, following that ruling, Ohio began introducing other, more specialized voucher programs. For instance, the Autism Scholarship Program was established in 2004-2005.
For students with autism specifically.
Right, for autistic students from pre-K through 12th grade. And the maximum scholarship amounts for this program have steadily increased over the years, reflecting the high cost of specialized care. It went from $27,000 up to $31,500 in fiscal year 2022, and then to $32,445 in fiscal year 2023.
Okay, so specialized programs. And then came the broader statewide program that most people in Ohio know today, EdChoice.
That's right. The EdChoice Scholarship Program was launched statewide in the 2006-2007 school year.
What was its initial intent? How was it first set up?
It was first conceived, or at least marketed, to provide options for students attending public schools that the state had officially designated as underperforming or failing.
So ostensibly, helping kids get out of struggling schools.
That was the idea, yes. Give those students a way to attend participating private schools instead. However, over time, the focus has shifted dramatically, really dramatically.
How so?
Now, a significant and increasingly dominant part of the program is the EdChoice expansion. And that part is primarily income-based, not based on the performance of the public school.
Income-based, meaning?
Meaning it's become accessible to a much wider range of families based on their household income, regardless of whether their assigned public school is deemed underperforming or not. It's a significant departure from its original premise.
Okay, so it's expanded quite a bit. How exactly does EdChoice divert public funds? Where does the money actually come from, and what's the mechanism for it getting to the private schools? It sounds like it pulls resources directly from the public education pot.
The funding mechanism is absolutely critical to understanding the impact, and yeah, it's often a major point of contention. The funds for these vouchers come directly from the exact same state budget line item that funds our public schools.
It's the same line item, not a separate fund.
Not a separate pot of money at all. It's from the same general education fund that sends state aid to traditional public districts.
So how does the money physically move?
Well, historically, if a student decided to use a voucher, her public school district would first receive the state funding allocation for her, on paper at least. Then they would be required to transfer that money to the private school she chose.
So it passed through the public school's books?
Originally, yes. But in recent years, the process has been streamlined, supposedly for efficiency. Now, the state often sends the funds directly to the private school, bypassing the public district's ledger entirely.
Okay, so the public district is just cut out of the middle now.
Pretty much. But the fundamental point remains unchanged. It's still the same public money being diverted from the overall pot intended for public education.
And you mentioned earlier when we were talking about funding something about a non-level playing field between public and private schools under this system.
Precisely. And this is where the argument about vouchers undermining public education really gains traction and becomes clearer.
How does that work?
Remember how public schools in Ohio are responsible for generating over 50% of their funding locally, primarily through those voter-approved local property tax levies, subject to HB 920.
Right, the constant levy cycle.
Well, private schools receiving vouchers are not subject to the same local funding structure. They don't have to pass local property tax levies to fund their operations in the same way public schools do.
Ah, okay, so they get the state money without the local tax burden requirement.
Essentially, yes. There was a hypothetical used in one source. If a student like Molly Marymount stays in Marymount City schools, the district receives around $2,000 per year in state funding for her education.
Okay, $2,000 state share.
But if Molly enrolls in a private or charter school using a voucher, the state contribution to that private or charter school for her education can, as the source put it, skyrocket.
Skyrocket, meaning much more than the $2,000 the public school would have gotten.
The implication is that the state pays significantly more per voucher student than the state share that would have gone to the public school. And that increased state payment doesn't have to be matched by local private school fundraising or tuition in the same way public schools rely on their local communities via levies.
That definitely sounds like an unequal financial setup.
It creates a significant financial disadvantage for public schools trying to compete for resources and serve all students.
The financial scope of these programs, particularly EdChoice, it seems to have grown dramatically just in the last decade or so. Can you give us a clearer picture of the current financial impact and how eligibility has blown up?
The growth has been nothing short of substantial. Truly monumental is probably a better word. In fiscal year 2022, the maximum EdChoice voucher amounts were significantly increased. They went up to $5,500 for K-8 students and $7,500 for high school students.
$5,500 and $7,500 per student per year.
Correct. And the Cleveland program uses these same amounts. But critically, these voucher amounts are actually set to increase annually from fiscal year 2024 onward.
How are they increasing?
They're indexed. They increase by the same percentage as the average per pupil-based cost increases in the school funding formula for traditional public districts.
So if public school-based funding goes up, voucher amounts automatically go up by the same percentage.
Exactly. They're linked, ensuring voucher amounts keep pace with or are tied to public school funding increases.
Wow. And what about the overall financial outflow, the total cost to the state?
The total voucher payments have absolutely escalated dramatically. They increased from $174.8 million back in fiscal year 2014.
Okay, $175 million about 10 years ago.
To a staggering $554.5 million in fiscal year 2022.
Over $500 million in 2022. That's more than a threefold increase in less than a decade.
More than triple, yes. And looking ahead, the recent budget proposals aim to expand eligibility even further. Governor DeWine's FY 24-25 budget proposal sought to significantly increase eligibility for that EdChoice expansion program.
The income-based one, how much?
From 250% of the federal poverty level, or FPL, up to 400% of the FPL.
Okay, what does that mean in real dollars for a family?
To put that in more relatable terms, for a family of four, that meant raising the income threshold to qualify from about $75,000 a year to $120,000 a year.
$120,000 income eligibility. That's pretty middle class, not just low income anymore.
Definitely moving up the income ladder. And the Legislative Service Commission, the LSC, they're the nonpartisan research arm of the Ohio General Assembly. They estimated this change alone would add $65.8 million in FY24 and another $61.7 million in FY25 to the total voucher payments.
Just that one expansion adds nearly $130 million over 2 years.
That was the estimate for the governor's proposal, yes. Nearly $130 million extra.
And I understand the Ohio House wanted to go even further than the governor.
They did. The Ohio House proposal for that same FY 24-25 budget suggested an even further increase, raising eligibility to 450% of the FPL.
450%? What income level is that?
For a family of four, that would raise the eligibility threshold to about $135,000 per year.
$135,000 income and still qualify for a taxpayer-funded private school voucher.
That was the House proposal. And the LSC estimated that would add an additional $49 million annually on top of the governor's proposed increase.
So huge expansions being proposed. What percentage of Ohio kids would fall under these expanded eligibility levels?
It's a significant portion of the state's children. Using 2021 census data, roughly 46% of Ohio children aged 6-17 were at or below the original 250% FPL level.
Okay, almost half.
But that jumps to 69%, more than two-thirds at or below 400% FPL, which was the governor's proposal.
Wow, 69%.
And a remarkable 74%, nearly three-quarters of all Ohio school-aged children would fall at or below the 450% FPL mark proposed by the House.
Three-quarters of kids potentially eligible? That demonstrates a vast increase, moving it way beyond just the lowest income families.
Absolutely. It fundamentally changes who the program serves.
This significant expansion, both in cost and eligibility, naturally leads to that central criticism we hear, that these vouchers are actually undermining public education rather than simply offering alternative choices.
How does this program fundamentally alter the landscape for public schools in practice? That's a core argument from critics, yeah. And the data really supports a significant shift in the program's actual impact, moving away from its original stated goals.
How so? What changed?
One of the most significant changes, buried in the legislative details over the years, was the elimination of the public school attendance requirement.
Meaning what?
Meaning students no longer need to have attended a public school in the year prior to receiving an EdChoice voucher. They could already be in a private school.
Okay. That seems like a small change, but maybe it wasn't.
It seems small, but it has profoundly altered the program's focus and who benefits. Consider these figures. In fiscal year 2018, only 8.4% of new K-8 EdChoice students.
Okay, new voucher users.
And a mere 3.6% of new high school EdChoice students had not attended a public school the year prior. So the vast majority were coming from public schools back then.
Right, that fits the original narrative.
But by fiscal year 2022, just 4 years later, these figures jumped drastically. 46.0%, nearly half of new K-8 EdChoice students, had not previously attended public school.
Almost half were already outside the public system.
And for new high school students, it was 66.6% to two-thirds who had not attended public school the year before getting the voucher.
2/3 of new high school voucher recipients were already not in public schools.
Correct. And for the EdChoice expansion program, the income-based one, it went from 53.1% of new recipients not having prior public attendance in FY18 to 69.3% in FY22.
So nearly 70% of new income-based voucher users were also not coming directly from public schools by 2022.
Exactly.
So what you're really saying is that a large and rapidly growing number of students receiving these taxpayer-funded vouchers weren't even in public schools to begin with.
That's what the data clearly shows.
The program isn't primarily helping students leave underperforming public schools anymore. It's increasingly funding students who are already attending private schools.
Precisely. This shift fundamentally means the state is increasingly paying for private school education for students whose families, as critics forcefully point out, have already demonstrated that they can afford to do so themselves, but already being enrolled there.
So it's become more of a subsidy for existing private school families than an escape hatch from public schools.
That's the argument, and the numbers regarding prior enrollment seem to bear that out. It's shifted from primarily providing options for students leaving supposedly low-performing public schools to subsidizing existing private school choices for a very broad range of income levels. This fundamentally changes the nature and the original stated purpose of the program.
And what about accountability? When these public funds go to private institutions, is there the same level of transparency for taxpayers as there is with public schools? Do we know how the money's being used?
That's another major concern that frequently arises in these debates. Vouchers are often described by critics as an unfunded mandate with zero accountability.
Zero accountability, that sounds strong.
Well, unlike public schools, which are subject to rigorous public audits, open records laws, and detailed transparency requirements, some private schools, particularly those operated by for-profit management companies, often keep their financial records private.
So it's harder to follow the money.
It makes it incredibly difficult, if not impossible in some cases, for the public to track precisely how that public tax money is being spent and what educational outcomes are truly being achieved for those dollars.
And what's the ultimate impact on the public schools left behind, according to advocates?
From the perspective of public school advocates, this diversion of funds inevitably leads to less money available for the public schools that serve the vast majority of students. This can exacerbate the existing funding problems we've already discussed.
Making their challenges even harder.
Right. Causing public schools, as one source described it, to fall as they've lost funding and struggle even more to meet their broad obligations to educate every child who comes through their doors.
It also sounds like it creates a significantly unequal playing field, not just financially, but in terms of who these different types of schools actually serve.
It absolutely does. For children in many rural areas of Ohio, for example, access to participating private schools can be extremely limited. Often, the only options available might be religiously affiliated private schools, leaving few, if any, secular private choices.
Limited options in some areas.
And perhaps a more significant, often overlooked, difference is who they serve. Private schools can, and often do, choose not to admit or retain students they deem not a good fit.
What does not a good fit usually mean?
It could be for academic reasons, behavioral issues, or because the student has special needs that the private school isn't equipped for or doesn't want to serve. They can be selective.
But public schools can't do that.
Absolutely not. Public schools, by contrast, are legally mandated to accept and serve all students who live within their district boundaries, regardless of academic history, behavioral challenges, language barriers, or complex special needs.
They have to take everyone.
They have to take everyone. This means public schools are left to serve every child in their community, including those with the most complex and often most expensive needs, frequently with a shrinking pool of resources, partly due to these voucher diversions. Public schools simply cannot fix structural societal problems like poverty or trauma that impact student performance, nor are they designed or allowed to be selective in their admissions like private schools can be.
We've also seen some public concerns raised in some of the source material we reviewed, specifically about the religious aspect of some of these schools that receive public EdChoice funds. It's important we note these are comments from the public reflecting a viewpoint out there, and we are simply reporting them as part of the public discourse.
Yes, that's right. Some public comments included in the source material highlight concerns about potential religious indoctrination when public funds are directed to religiously affiliated private schools.
What kind of concerns?
These concerns suggest that for some members of the public, the use of vouchers is perceived as a way to use taxpayer money to indoctrinate their kids with their religion. Some comments specifically reference things like required daily Bible classes in certain schools that accept state charter or voucher money. According to one public comment we found, discussions in these classes can sometimes extend beyond general moral teachings to include controversial social or political issues presented from a specific religious viewpoint.
Okay, so that's a concern some people have raised.
Yes, and again, we want to be very clear. We are simply reporting on the content provided in the source material about these public perceptions and not endorsing these viewpoints ourselves. It is part of the ongoing public debate around vouchers.
And just to show how widespread the participation is in some sectors, what about Catholic schools?
It's definitely notable and a clear indicator of the program's reach and significance for certain private school systems. In the Diocese of Cleveland, for example, a substantial 78% of all Catholic school students participated in the EdChoice program in the 2024-2025 school year.
78%. Wow, that indicates a very significant reliance on the EdChoice program within that particular system.
Very significant reliance, yeah.
Okay. It's abundantly clear that Ohio's school funding landscape has been marked by these persistent challenges, particularly around equity and adequacy, as the DeRolph rulings kept hammering home.
Decades of challenges.
So, to try and address these long-standing, deep-seated issues, the Fair School Funding Plan was developed more recently. What was its core purpose? What was it trying to finally solve?
The Fair School Funding Plan was indeed created as a direct response to those very core problems that the DeRolph rulings repeatedly highlighted, the persistent issues of equity and adequacy in Ohio's public school system.
So, trying to get it right this time.
That was the goal, yes. Its overarching aim was to move Ohio away from temporary, stopgap solutions and previous funding models that hadn't worked or weren't fully implemented, like Governor Strickland's evidence-based models from back in 2009.
What was wrong with that one?
Well, while it was theoretically sound, based on evidence of what works, it proved to be a very expensive funding model when you actually calculated the full cost, and ultimately it wasn't entirely funded or sustained. So the new plan aimed for something more stable, predictable, and truly equitable that addressed the actual structural deficiencies.
So how was the Fair School Funding Plan actually supposed to achieve that stability and equity? What was its fundamental mechanism? How did it change the calculation?
It attempts to create this more stable, equitable system by, first, rigorously calculating the actual cost of educating each student. This is what's referred to as the base cost.
Based on real inputs like teacher salaries, class sizes, etc.
Exactly. Based on the components needed for a quality education. The plan then aims to gradually phase in state funding over several years. I believe it's a 6-year phase-in initially planned to meet that identified base cost for every student, regardless of their zip code or local property wealth.
Trying to level the playing field with state dollars?
That's the idea. For instance, the Ohio House proposed FY 24-25 budget, building on the plan, increased the statewide average base cost calculation from $7,352 per pupil in FY 22 and FY 23, up to $8,241 per pupil for FY 24 and FY 25. That's a 12.1% increase in the calculated cost, partly achieved by updating the salary and other cost data used in the formula, trying to bring it closer to real-world expenses.
So the idea is a much more data-driven, predictable funding stream, moving away from those old formulas that led to the huge DeRolph disparities.
Yeah, so the core concept behind it, yes.
That sounds like a significant and frankly necessary step in the right direction, a real attempt to finally align funding with actual costs after decades of problems.
It was widely seen as such by education advocates, yes. A bipartisan effort, initially.
Despite the plan being in place, it seems issues still persist. What exactly hasn't it achieved, or where are the current challenges lying with the Fair School Funding Plan? It hasn't been smooth sailing.
No. Despite its earnest intentions and, frankly, sophisticated design, the plan has faced significant challenges and criticisms, mainly concerning its full implementation and its sustainability over the long term.
Meaning it's not being fully funded as designed.
That's a major issue. Many districts, like Milford Exempted Village Schools, for example, have felt compelled to pass official resolutions publicly urging the Ohio General Assembly to fully fund years 5 and 6 of the Fair School funding formula.
So the later years of the phase-in are in jeopardy.
That's the concern. They're also urging the state to update the base cost inputs to reflect inflation and real-world expenses. This clearly indicates that even with the plan technically in place, districts feel the funding allocated through it isn't actually keeping pace with their real escalating needs, despite the formula's own calculations suggesting higher costs.
So the formula says one thing, but the funding doesn't always follow.
That seems to be the disconnect. Milford also specifically urged the rejection of proposed cuts to guaranteed funding levels for districts like Milford, which highlights these constant legislative battles over funding stability, even within the framework of the new plan.
So even as they try to establish this more equitable system on paper, there are still proposals circulating in the legislature that threaten to undermine it, making it an uphill battle to fully realize the plan's potential.
Absolutely. It's a constant push and pull. Furthermore, critics argue that the governor's 2025 budget proposal, despite the Fair School Funding Plan's existence and intent, has been seen by some as actually further reducing funding for public schools while simultaneously increasing taxpayer-funded subsidies for private and charter schools through EdChoice expansion.
Working at cross purposes, essentially.
It effectively creates these counter-pressures that erode the progress the Fair School Funding Plan aims to make. Critics contend that approach artificially lowers the state aid to public schools by changing only one side of the equation, meaning adjusting public school funding calculations downwards, perhaps, or not fully funding the formula, while at the same time expanding private school vouchers funded from that same overall education budget.
So fundamentally, are all students getting the same level of state support under recent proposals?
Well, critics argue that not all students in the 2025 budget proposal receive the same level of state funding for their education, regardless of the quality or performance of the public schools in the area, which, if true, directly contradicts the very spirit of the DeRolph rulings that sought to establish that one system of education for all Ohio children.
Back to the same core problem. And how does Ohio compare nationally, just in terms of its overall financial effort to fund public education? Does this plan push us up the ranks?
That's a good question. When we look at Ohio's effort index, which is a measure comparing the state and local funding devoted to K-12 education relative to the state's overall economic productivity or capacity.
Okay, how much are we trying, given our wealth?
Right. Ohio's effort index was 3.8% back in 2016, which ranked it 18th nationally.
18th? That's not terrible, but not leading the pack either.
Exactly. While certainly not the lowest in the nation, that figure still raises important questions about the overall priority the state places on public education funding compared to other states, especially given our constitutional mandate.
So the Fair School Funding Plan, an earnest, long-awaited attempt, but it clearly hasn't fully solved the problem of equitable and adequate funding across all districts yet.
Especially with other policies like the expanding voucher program, acting as powerful counterpressures.
Yeah.
It's a significant step, yes, but the journey to truly fulfill that constitutional mandate of a thorough and efficient system is far from over.
And this brings us right up to the present day and the most recent and highly significant development in Ohio school funding. Just 2 days ago, Monday, June 24th, 2025, there was a major court ruling specifically concerning the EdChoice program.
That's right. Huge news this week.
What exactly did the Franklin County Common Pleas Court decide?
On June 24th, a Franklin County Common Pleas Court judge, Judge Jaza Page, indeed ruled Ohio's EdChoice scholarship program unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional. That's a monumental decision, isn't it?
It really is, reflecting years of sustained legal challenges against the program. It's a very significant moment in this ongoing, decades-long debate over how Ohio funds its schools.
Can you tell us more about the lawsuit itself? Who are the plaintiffs who brought this challenge forward?
Sure. The lawsuit that led to this ruling was initially filed way back in January of 2022. It was brought by a coalition of public school district leaders from across Ohio, forming a group called Vouchers Hurt Ohio.
Okay, representing a range of public schools.
Yes, they represented a broad range of districts, large and small, urban and rural, arguing that EdChoice siphoned vital funds from public education and violated the state's constitutional mandates, particularly that thorough and efficient clause from DeRolph.
And who was defending EdChoice in court?
On the other side, the program was vigorously defended by the state of Ohio, specifically through the Ohio Attorney General's office.
Okay, the state defended its own program. Anyone else?
Yes, they were joined in their defense by the Institute for Justice, which is a national nonprofit public interest law firm known for its strong advocacy for school choice programs nationwide.
Right, IJ is often involved in these cases.
And also by a group of families with children currently attending Catholic schools using EdChoice vouchers. The Catholic Conference of Ohio was also closely involved in supporting the defense, given, as we noted, the significant participation of Catholic schools in the EdChoice program.
So a coalition of districts versus the state, a pro-voucher law firm, and voucher families. And the judge sided with
The judge ultimately found in favor of the plaintiffs, the public school districts. She ruled for them on 3 of the 5 specific counts that were brought against the EdChoice program, signaling a strong legal basis for her finding that the program, as currently structured and funded, is unconstitutional.
Okay, that sounds like a profound victory for public school advocates. What are the immediate implications of this ruling? What does it mean for students currently using EdChoice vouchers right now, today, June 26th?
That's a really crucial clarification to make, because despite this significant ruling, the EdChoice scholarship program will continue to operate while the case moves through the appeals process.
So no immediate stop to the vouchers.
No immediate stop. The ruling doesn't halt the program in its tracks today. This means that for students currently using vouchers or planning to use them this coming school year, there won't be an immediate disruption or change to their educational funding. The judge did not issue an injunction to stop payments.
Okay, that's important for families to know, but the ruling itself is still hugely significant, right?
Oh, absolutely. While the immediate impact is limited, this ruling represents another incredibly significant judicial challenge to Ohio's overall school funding system. And it very strongly echoes the DeRolph rulings that repeatedly found the state's public education funding system unconstitutional.
So it's kind of applying similar constitutional principles to the voucher side.
It seems to be doing that, yes. It clearly reinforces the argument made forcefully by the plaintiffs and their supporters that the state, as they put it, cannot send millions to private schools while claiming too poor to fund public, then turn around and attempt defund public even more.
It highlights that tension.
Exactly. It signifies that the courts are, once again, scrutinizing the state's approach to education funding, both public and private subsidies, and its fundamental constitutional obligations to provide that thorough and efficient system of common schools, meaning public schools.
So this legal battle is clearly far from over then. What's the very next step we can expect in this ongoing legal drama surrounding EdChoice?
Well, the state of Ohio, through the Attorney General's office, has already publicly confirmed that they plan a swift appeal.
A swift appeal. No surprise there.
No surprise at all. This clearly indicates that the legal battle over EdChoice is far from resolved and will almost certainly proceed to higher courts.
Likely the Ohio Supreme Court eventually.
Most likely, yes. That's where these major constitutional challenges typically end up. This means we can anticipate a potentially protracted legal process, possibly lasting for quite some time, maybe years, as the ruling is challenged and reviewed by appellate courts.
So this week's ruling is a significant marker, a major development, but it is not by any means the final word on the constitutionality of EdChoice in Ohio.
Not at all. It's simply the latest, very important chapter in Ohio's long, tangled, and complex story of school funding.
Okay. Now, let's pivot and tackle some of those common questions and persistent misconceptions that you, our listeners, often have about school funding in Ohio. These things seem to circulate endlessly.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of confusion out there.
One of the most persistent myths, something we hear all the time, is, didn't the lottery fund schools? I thought all that lottery money was supposed to go to education.
Ah, the lottery question. That's an incredibly common misconception, and it really speaks to how much public understanding of school finance often differs from the complex reality.
So does the lottery fund schools or not?
Well, the Ohio Lottery does contribute some money to state education funds, yes, but it's absolutely crucial to understand that it is not the primary source of revenue for Ohio school districts. Not even close.
Okay, so where does most of the money come from then?
As we've discussed, the vast majority of funding for schools comes from 2 main sources. First, state revenue, most of which is provided through that school foundation program we talked about, the one based on the Fair School Funding Plan formula currently.
Okay, state aid. And second,
local revenue, which, as we've gone into depth on, consists primarily of those locally voted school district property tax levies, the ones subject to HB 920.
State aid and local property taxes are the big 2. Where do federal funds fit in?
Federal funds play only a minor supplementary role in the overall financing scheme for most districts' general operations. They're often targeted for specific programs like for low-income students or special education, but they're not the main driver.
And Ohio relies more on the local part than the state part, right?
Historically, yes. Ohio has relied more heavily on local revenue than on state revenue, which, as we said, is contrary to the national trend, where states typically take on a larger share of the funding burden.
And has that state share been going up since DeRolph told them to fix it?
Actually, no. Despite those repeated court rulings urging adequate state funding, the state's share of per-student funding has actually declined over time relative to the total cost.
Declined, wow.
So, while the lottery does contribute some funds to the overall education budget, it's a relatively small piece of a much larger, complex, and often challenged funding puzzle. That puzzle is overwhelmingly dominated by local property taxes and state aid formulas. The lottery is far from the magic bullet funding source many people believe it to be.
Okay, good clarification. And speaking of those local property taxes, the next question we frequently hear, almost with a sigh of resignation from people, is, why are school levies always on the ballot? It feels like schools are constantly asking for more money every few years, sometimes every year.
Yeah, you hear that frustration a lot. And this question gets right to the heart of the issue we discussed in detail earlier. It links directly back to House Bill 920 from 1976.
Remind us how HB 920 causes this.
Okay, so as property values go up during those regular county reappraisals, HB 920 applies its tax reduction factor. This mechanism causes the effective millage rates of existing voter-approved levies to generally go down.
So the rate drops to offset the value increase.
Right. The fundamental purpose of HB 920 was precisely to prevent school districts from receiving additional revenue from those voted levies just because property values rose due to inflation or market forces.
So what does that mean for their budget?
It means that just to maintain their existing services, pay salaries that keep up with inflation, cover rising utility costs, buy supplies that cost more, let alone expand programs or reduce class sizes, schools must repeatedly ask voters to approve new levies.
Because the money they get from the levies voters already approved years ago, thanks to HB 920, essentially buys less and less each year.
Exactly. Its purchasing power erodes relative to costs. And this constant, almost annual or biennial need to go back to the ballot for new money leads directly to what we accurately called levy fatigue among voters.
And that's why Ohio has the most levies.
That's why Ohio has the most school levies in the nation. It's not uncommon for districts to try multiple times to get a levy approved, creating this perception of schools having never-ending requests for more money, even if, in many cases, they're just trying to maintain current operations and prevent painful cuts. It really is a treadmill that districts are forced onto by this specific state law.
Okay. Beyond those specific, very common questions about the lottery and levy frequency, what are some other frequent misconceptions or maybe arguments that come up a lot in the public discourse around school funding, particularly when the conversation turns to public versus private schools and vouchers?
Yeah, there are definitely a few recurring themes. A very frequent argument you'll hear, especially in the context of defending EdChoice or promoting school choice, is that private schools offer better education, or that they provide healthy competition that forces public schools to improve.
A competition argument, right?
Right. However, it's really crucial to consider the underlying dynamics and, frankly, the different mandates under which these different types of schools operate. As one public comment in our source material pointed out, somewhat cynically perhaps, private schools are obviously made up of all parents who pay special attention to their kids' education.
Implying more involved parents choose private.
That's one implication. But perhaps more importantly, and this is a significant structural distinction, private schools have the luxury, the ability, to gleefully kick out anyone they deem not a good fit.
They can be selective.
Highly selective, yes. Whether that's for academic reasons, behavioral issues, or because a student has special needs they aren't equipped for or simply don't want to serve. Public schools, by stark contrast, as we said, have to take everyone.
It's the law.
It's the law. They are legally mandated to accept all students who live within their district boundaries. Full stop. Regardless of academic history, behavioral challenges, special needs, language barriers, or socioeconomic background. Public schools simply cannot fix structural societal problems like poverty or lack of health care that deeply impact student performance. Nor are they designed or allowed to be selective in their admissions like private schools can be.
So comparing them directly based on outcomes is often an apples to oranges comparison because they serve fundamentally different populations under different roles.
Exactly. They operate under fundamentally different obligations and constraints, and public schools have the mandate to serve every child in their community.
Okay. What about the argument that vouchers specifically help students escape failing schools? That's often presented as the primary rationale, right? The moral imperative behind them.
Yes, that certainly was an initial intent, or at least the initial marketing pitch, and it's a very compelling narrative. However, the data we looked at paints a much more nuanced picture of the program's evolution and its current impact.
The prior enrollment data.
Exactly. As we discussed earlier, there has been that dramatic and significant increase in voucher recipients who were not enrolled in public schools the year prior to receiving a taxpayer-funded voucher, suggesting that the program is increasingly paying for private school education for students whose families have already demonstrated that they can afford to do so themselves by already being enrolled, or who had simply already chosen private education for other reasons, rather than primarily providing options for students truly leaving designated, low-performing public schools.
So the reality has diverged from the rationale.
The shift in eligibility criteria, especially the broad income-based expansion and the elimination of the prior public school attendance rule, has significantly broadened the program's actual impact far beyond its initial stated purpose. It's led to a substantial state subsidy for existing private school enrollments across a wide income spectrum.
Okay. Finally, there's the perception, maybe more of an accusation sometimes, that there should be plenty of funding if schools could just apply it efficiently. This implies the problem isn't the system or the funding level, but rather mismanagement within the public schools themselves.
Right, the waste, fraud, and abuse argument applied to schools. And while efficiency is, and always should be, a goal for any organization, especially one using public funds, including schools,
Sure, efficiency matters.
the core issue at play in Ohio, according to decades of court rulings, DeRolph I, DeRolph II, and extensive legislative analysis, is the structural insufficiency of state funding and the persistent problematic over-reliance on local property taxes hampered by HB 920.
So the courts pointed to the system, not just how districts spent money.
Exactly. The courts repeatedly identified the system itself as unconstitutional because it failed, and arguably still fails, to provide that thorough and efficient education across the state, regardless of how efficiently individual districts might manage their budgets within those incredibly difficult constraints.
And vouchers and HB 920 make it worse.
This fundamental problem of an inadequate and inequitable system is then compounded and exacerbated by laws like HB 920, which actively suppress revenue growth from existing local levies, and the ongoing diversion of hundreds of millions of dollars in public funds through expanding voucher programs like EdChoice. So it's not just about how money is spent locally, it's fundamentally about how the money gets there or doesn't get there in the first place, and whether there's enough of it distributed fairly to meet Ohio's constitutional mandate to begin with. It's truly a systemic, not just an operational challenge.
And that wraps up our deep dive into Ohio's incredibly complex and often frustrating school funding landscape. We've traced the challenging history from that initial Walter case all the way through the landmark DeRolph rulings.
We explored the persistent and often hidden impact of House Bill 920 on local revenues.
We dissected the growth and the very controversial nature of the EdChoice voucher program.
And looked at how all these factors intertwine to shape the actual educational experience for students across the entire state.
It's abundantly clear that Ohio's journey toward establishing that truly thorough and efficient system of common schools, the one mandated by its own constitution, is still very much ongoing, decades later.
It really is. This journey is marked by these complex legal battles, like the one decided just this week, significant financial pressures on local communities always facing levy campaigns, and these ongoing, often contentious policy debates at the State House.
And the June 2025 ruling on EdChoice is definitely a fresh and pivotal chapter in that story.
Absolutely. But the broader narrative, the fundamental challenge of ensuring equitable and adequate education for all children in Ohio, that remains a critical and still unresolved challenge for the state.
This deep dive really reveals that school funding is far more than just a budget line item, isn't it? It's a profound reflection of our collective priorities as a state.
Yeah, and our constitutional commitment to future generations, and really the very foundation of opportunity for every single child in Ohio.
So as this EdChoice case now moves through the appeals process, and as local districts continue to face those relentless pressures of HB 920 and questions about state support levels, what further questions does this deep dive raise for you about the future of public education in Ohio?
How will Ohio finally truly secure that thorough and efficient system of common schools throughout the state that its own constitution has so clearly mandated for so long? It's a question that demands our continued attention and, frankly, action.
That's it for this deep dive from Grounded by the Neutral Wire. If this helped you make sense of what's really happening with school funding in Ohio, subscribe and share it with someone in your district.
We'll be back soon with more stories that follow the current of what's really powering our communities.
Until next time, stay grounded.